Mark lived in a small village. It was nestled between rolling hills and a dark, whispering forest. The village was old, its houses creaking with age. The oldest house stood at the edge of the village, shrouded in shadow. Locals called it the Whispering House. They said it was haunted. Mark and his friends loved scary stories. They huddled around campfires, sharing tales of ghosts and ghouls. The Whispering House was a frequent character in their stories. They dared each other to go inside, but none dared accept until now. The old iron gate groaned as they pushed it open. The overgrown garden was dark and silent. Dead leaves crunched under their feet. The house loomed before them, its windows like empty eyes. A shiver ran down Mark's spine. He wasn't sure he wanted to do this anymore. They crept up the creaking steps to the front door. Mark reached for the rusty handle. It was cold and damp in his hand. He took a deep breath and turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dark and dusty hallway. The air inside was heavy and stale. Cobwebs hung from every corner. The only light came from the moon shining through the grimy windows. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He stepped inside, his friends close behind. The hallway was lined with portraits of stern-faced people. Their eyes seemed to follow Mark as he walked. He ran his hand along the dusty frames, his fingers tracing the edges of forgotten faces. He stopped before a portrait of a beautiful woman with piercing blue eyes. She wore a long, flowing gown and a pearl necklace. Her lips were curved into a faint smile. Mark felt drawn to her. He couldn't take his eyes off hers. They seemed to sparkle with a strange light. "She's beautiful," whispered his friend Sarah. "But there's something about her eyes." Mark nodded. He felt it too. A sense of unease settled over him. He tore his gaze from the portrait and continued down the hallway. They reached the end of the hallway and stopped before a heavy wooden door. Mark pushed it open, and they entered a large, dusty room. Moonlight streamed through a broken window, illuminating a grand piano in the corner. The keys were covered in dust. Mark walked over to the piano and ran his fingers lightly over the keys. A low, mournful note echoed through the silent house. He jumped back, startled by the sound. As he did, he noticed something glinting beneath the piano. He knelt down and reached under the piano. His fingers closed around a small heart-shaped locket. He pulled it out and blew off the dust. The locket was cold in his hand. It was made of silver and had a delicate floral design. Mark tried to open it, but it was stuck. Mark stood in the center of the room, the locket clutched tightly in his hand. He tried to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, he raised his arm to throw the locket across the room. "Don't!" Sarah cried out, but it was too late. Mark had already thrown the locket. It sailed through the air and clattered against the wall. The room went dark. All sound ceased. Then from the shadows, a cold wind began to blow. The shadows on the walls writhed and twisted. They grew longer, darker, taking on monstrous shapes. Mark watched in terror as the shadows coalesced into figures. They had glowing red eyes and mouths that opened in silent screams. The shadowy figures lunged for Mark's friends. Screams filled the air as the shadows enveloped them, dragging them into the darkness. Mark was frozen in terror. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then he heard her voice. "Mark," the voice whispered. It was the woman from the portrait. Her voice was close, right next to his ear. "Run, Mark," she breathed. "Run!" Mark snapped out of his trance. He turned and ran. He didn't look back. He could hear his friends screaming his name, but he didn't stop. He burst out of the house and into the night. He ran until he reached the safety of his own home. Mark never went back to the Whispering House, but the woman's voice followed him. He heard it in his dreams, in the shadows, in the rustling leaves. "Mark," she whispered, "you can't hide from me forever." Mark knew then that he would never escape the Whispering House. It would haunt him forever.